On Sunday, 7th January 1945, deep within the snow-covered Ardennes forest of northern Europe, the fragile facade of Allied harmony in World War II fractured publicly in a way that stunned commanders and politicians alike. A press conference convened that day by British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, known informally to many as Monty, touched off one of the sharpest crises in the coalition relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. The Battle of the Bulge, which had erupted on 16 December 1944 and become the largest German offensive on the Western Front, was moving into its final phase, but the political ramifications of Montgomery's words threatened to undo months of hard-won cooperation among commanders at every level. Montgomery's wartime reputation was formidable. A British commander with victories in North Africa and Sicily, he was respected among many of his own troops and admired by sections of the British public and press. But his relationship with American officers was more contentious. Tensions had been present for years, rooted in disagreements over strategy, command, and military doctrine. Montgomery tended to favor methodical, deliberate planning and centralized control, while his American counterparts often emphasized flexibility, aggressive maneuver, and decentralized initiative. These underlying disagreements were not inherently problematic during much of the conflict, but by early 1945 they had grown sharper and sharper. The immediate cause of the January episode began with Montgomery's handling of a press event in the aftermath of the Ardennes crisis. As the bulge carved by German forces in December was being reduced by Allied counterattacks from both north and south, Montgomery sought to summarize his view of the situation for journalists. But what he said, and the way he said it, touched raw nerves. American generals and journalists interpreted his remarks as a condescending portrayal of American troops, implying that British leadership had rescued U.S. forces from operational failure. Although subsequent reports and later investigations revealed that some media coverage was influenced by Nazi propaganda broadcasts designed to inflame Allied tensions, the initial impact of Montgomery's words was nonetheless serious. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, better known as SHAEF, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, saw the reactions from his American staff and commanders with growing alarm. Eisenhower was, by temperament and training, a cautious and consensus-oriented leader. His genius lay in managing an unprecedented coalition of national armies, diplomatic personalities, political expectations, and strategic priorities. Never was this more demanding than in the final months of 1944. The Western Front was strained, the German army still capable of dangerous counterattacks, and public morale in all Allied capitals highly sensitive to any suggestion of division or defeat. Montgomery's press commentary on January 7th was widely seen by American commanders, especially Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, as not merely insensitive but dismissive of the sacrifice and performance of American troops. They felt that Montgomery's emphasis on his own actions and the absence of clear recognition for American efforts across the front transformed a factual account of the battle into a narrative that seemed to appropriate credit for success while minimizing U.S. contributions. Montgomery himself later acknowledged that the press conference was a serious mistake, reflecting the depth of resentment that his remarks had stirred. The reaction among American commanders was swift. Bradley was reported to have reacted with open anger, indicating that he would resign rather than serve under Montgomery again if he believed the British commander continued to claim credit for American efforts. General George S. Patton, known for his aggressive temperament, also expressed frustration. Within SHAEF and broader Allied command circles, there was a palpable sense that Montgomery had gone too far.
The unity of command that Eisenhower had spent years forging and which had been tested repeatedly since the Normandy campaign was suddenly undermined not by battlefield failure, but by perceived diplomatic and interpersonal clumsiness. Eisenhower's response to this crisis was shaped by his profound understanding of coalition leadership. He knew that the alliance between the United States and Britain was not simply a military convenience, it was a political necessity. The war could not be won, and certainly could not be sustained, if either side felt belittled or undervalued. Eisenhower also understood that commanders in the field were not merely military technicians, but political symbols whose words carried meaning far beyond their immediate context. Montgomery's remarks, whether intended to highlight British efforts or to counter foreign press criticism, essentially violated the unwritten rules of coalition diplomacy.
In the quiet hours that followed the press conference, Eisenhower's staff advised him of the growing sense of outrage among American commanders. They warned that continued controversy could lead to ruptures in operational cooperation, which, in the midst of one of the most significant campaigns of World War II, would have disastrous consequences. Eisenhower's decision-making process at that moment reflected his broader command philosophy. He would not sweep the problem under the rug, nor would he allow personal pride or personal loyalty to dictate the resolution of a crisis that threatened strategic unity. Historical records indicate that he considered a range of options, from privately reprimanding Montgomery to drafting a formal message demanding an apology or retraction. Montgomery's conduct in December and January was the culmination of months of accumulating tension. Earlier in 1944, he had repeatedly questioned Eisenhower's broad front strategy, the Allied plan to advance simultaneously across a wide front in Germany, instead advocating for a narrow thrust that could break through quickly to Berlin. Many American officers saw this as unrealistic given the distribution of forces and logistical constraints of the time. Montgomery's outspoken advocacy for his preferred plan and his reluctance to subordinate himself fully to Eisenhower's broader strategic vision had already tested the patience of senior U.S. commanders. But the press conference and the interpretation given it by some elements of the U.S. command was the flashpoint. Eisenhower realized that if Montgomery continued to speak publicly in ways that appeared to diminish American effort, the cohesion of the Allied coalition would suffer. The unity that had carried the Allies through Normandy, the breakout from France, the liberation of Paris, and the push toward the Rhine was at risk. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, saw his role not only as a strategist on battlefields, but as a steward of political harmony among nations whose soldiers personified that alliance with their lives and sacrifices. What followed in the immediate aftermath was a series of private and highly sensitive communications among Eisenhower, Montgomery, and their respective chiefs of staff. Eisenhower drafted a stern message outlining his displeasure with Montgomery's conduct and suggesting that the situation, if allowed to continue, had the potential to make an already difficult command structure unworkable. In effect, Eisenhower placed before Montgomery and his supporters a stark choice between reconciling his public posture with the need for coalition unity or stepping aside from his command responsibilities so that the combined Allied command could continue to function without internal conflict. There was no dramatic shouting match or famous public ultimatum delivered by Eisenhower in the popular sense. What occurred was a sober and strategic assertion of authority by the Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower presented Montgomery with the reality that his continued actions, if they perpetuated discord, could not be tolerated. Montgomery's chief of staff carried Eisenhower's message to the British commander, emphasizing that the support of both Washington and London for Montgomery's continued role depended upon his acceptance of Eisenhower's leadership and the subordination of his own personal ambitions to the coalition's needs. This diplomatic pressure, grounded as much in political backing as military necessity, ultimately forced Montgomery to reassess his position. The crisis was diffused when Montgomery issued a private letter expressing regret for the controversy his public remarks had caused and reaffirming his commitment to the unified command structure under Eisenhower.
While there was no public get out or shut up moment with dramatic confrontation, the effect was functionally equivalent. Montgomery acknowledged that his statements had damaged coalition trust and that corrective action was needed. Eisenhower retained his authority as Supreme Allied Commander, and Montgomery continued his responsibilities, but the personal trust between the two commanders was profoundly weakened. In the weeks that followed, Eisenhower made adjustments in how he staffed and coordinated operations. He relied more heavily on American generals such as Omar Bradley to lead major ground offensives, including the drive toward the Rhine. That decision reflected not only the numerical and material superiority of U.S. forces at this stage of World War II, which were supplying the majority of manpower and equipment, but also Eisenhower's commitment to a balanced coalition command, where no partner felt undervalued or overruled in matters of battlefield recognition. Churchill and political leaders in London privately acknowledged that Montgomery had erred, reinforcing Eisenhower's position. Montgomery remained a decorated and respected figure in his own country, but his influence at SHAEF was diminished compared to what it had been 6 months earlier. The coalition did not fracture, but the episode served as a cautionary example of how personal ambition and public rhetoric could disrupt military alliances during wartime. From an educational perspective, this moment in World War II reveals the complex interplay of military command, coalition politics, personal ego, and strategic necessity. Eisenhower's decision to confront Montgomery's conduct was not about one man's pride, but about preserving the integrity of a multinational effort that depended on trust, respect, and coordination among nations whose soldiers fought side by side across Europe. It was a reminder that operational success on the battlefield must be matched by diplomatic skill in maintaining the alliances that made victory possible. In the final months of the war in Europe, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany, the lessons of the January 1945 crisis remained vivid. The Allied coalition succeeded because its leaders were ultimately willing to subordinate personal ambition to shared purpose, and because commanders like Eisenhower understood that unity of effort required unity of respect. The story of Montgomery's press controversy and Eisenhower's assertive response stands as a testament to the political dimensions of military leadership in World War II, where the battle for cohesion was as important as the battle against the enemy.
As January 1945 moved toward its conclusion, the diplomatic shockwaves created by Montgomery's controversial public remarks and Eisenhower's subsequent assertion of authority did not simply fade into the background of military operations. Instead, they continued to shape conversations within Allied headquarters, influencing how senior leaders reflected upon the delicate balance of personality, national pride, and strategic necessity that defined coalition warfare in World War II. The incident became a reminder that victory depended not only upon tanks, artillery, and infantry formations advancing across snow-covered fields, but also upon trust between commanders who represented nations with different traditions, cultures, and political expectations. Eisenhower's intervention reinforced an unwritten principle of the Allied command structure, that no single general, regardless of past achievement or reputation, could elevate personal prestige above the unity required to sustain a multinational army in the final and most decisive phase of the war. In the days that followed, Montgomery remained deeply aware of how the situation had affected his standing among American officers. Though he defended the factual content of his operational explanations, he came to recognize that tone, nuance, and emphasis carried as much weight in coalition communications as tactical accuracy. British records and later historical evaluations emphasized that Montgomery did not intend to insult or diminish American soldiers, but intention alone could not erase the perception created by his phrasing or by the atmosphere of rivalry that had grown since the Normandy campaign. Eisenhower's firm reaction forced a recalibration of behavior, not simply for Montgomery, but for the broader Allied command environment, where leaders increasingly understood that every public statement would be scrutinized not only for what it claimed about the enemy, but for what it implied about Allied partners. Meanwhile, American commanders such as Omar Bradley and George Patton channeled their frustrations into renewed operational focus. Rather than allowing anger to derail coordination, they continued to engage fully in the drive to compress and eliminate the German salient in the Ardennes. The bitter winter weather, frozen river crossings, and exhausted infantry units testified to the physical and psychological demands placed upon troops on both sides of the Atlantic. For Eisenhower, these conditions reinforced the urgency of restoring harmony within the command structure. He believed that soldiers in the field, many of whom faced temperatures below freezing, long marches, and sudden enemy counterattacks, deserved leaders who could rise above personal dispute in order to safeguard operational cohesion. Within the British government, Winston Churchill followed the episode with characteristic attentiveness. His political instincts had long attuned him to the fragility of wartime alliances and the importance of maintaining goodwill with the United States. Churchill understood that American industry, manpower, and logistical output had grown to a scale that positioned the United States as the primary driving force in the Western Allied war effort by 1945. While he continued to value Britain's strategic experience and moral resilience, he also recognized that public arguments among commanders risked creating diplomatic friction at a time when post-war political arrangements were already beginning to take shape. Thus, in London as well as in Washington, there was quiet acknowledgement that Eisenhower's decisive handling of the situation had preserved the broader political relationship upon which the future of Europe would soon depend. The event also became a subject of reflection for historians and military analysts studying the evolution of Allied leadership during World War II. Scholars examined the contrast between Eisenhower's consensus-oriented leadership style and Montgomery's assertive, sometimes confrontational approach to operational authority. Each style had strengths in different contexts. Montgomery's insistence on careful planning and discipline had contributed to success in North Africa and in earlier phases of the European campaign. Eisenhower's diplomatic skill and ability to manage egos had enabled the coordination of multiple national armies, air forces, and naval commands under a unified strategic vision. The January 1945 confrontation, therefore, did not simply symbolize personal conflict. It illustrated the ongoing process of reconciling divergent command philosophies within a coalition that was simultaneously military and political in nature. As the Allied armies resumed forward momentum following the Battle of the Bulge, the necessity of cooperation became even clearer. German resistance, though eroding, remained determined and capable of inflicting serious casualties. River lines, fortified towns, and entrenched positions demanded coordinated assaults between British, American, and Canadian formations. The integration of air support, artillery fire, and armored movement required careful synchronization across national boundaries. Eisenhower's firm insistence on unity ensured that, despite earlier tensions, the armies operating under his authority continued to advance along parallel axes that reinforced one another rather than competing for resources or recognition. Montgomery, for his part, persisted in advocating for what he believed to be the most effective operational structures in his sector of responsibility. But he did so with heightened awareness of the political implications surrounding coalition leadership. Decades later, historians would continue to debate whether his frustrations stemmed primarily from strategic disagreement, national loyalty, or personal temperament. Yet most agreed that the January episode demonstrated how easily military critique could be interpreted as national criticism when delivered within a multinational alliance fighting a global war.
The lessons drawn from this reality would influence how later military coalitions approached communication, press relations, and command integration. American soldiers who had fought through the Ardennes, including infantrymen, armored crews, engineers, and logistics personnel, returned to their units with renewed confidence in their leadership and in the recognition of their sacrifice. Eisenhower's willingness to defend their reputation before one of Britain's most prominent generals strengthened their sense of identity within the broader Allied war effort. For many, the controversy served as symbolic validation of the hardships they had endured during the winter counteroffensive, where they had absorbed the shock of one of Germany's final major operations and held the line under extraordinary conditions. At the same time, British and Commonwealth troops continued to view Montgomery as a capable and determined commander, whose emphasis on minimizing unnecessary losses resonated with many who had lived through earlier phases of the war. By early spring 1945, as preparations intensified for crossing the Rhine and pushing into the heart of Germany, the Allied command appeared more stable and unified than it had been during the tense weeks of January. Eisenhower maintained open channels of communication with both British and American leaders, reaffirming the principle that strategic objectives required shared understanding and mutual respect. His experience during the Montgomery crisis sharpened his awareness of the importance of language, framing, and acknowledgement of contribution, elements that extended far beyond battlefield maneuvers into the realm of political symbolism and public perception. From an educational perspective, the episode stands as a rich case study in the complexities of coalition warfare. It highlights how leadership in World War II extended beyond the application of military doctrine or tactical ingenuity, encompassing diplomacy, emotional intelligence, and the capacity to manage personalities under extreme pressure. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery reminds students of history that even among allies pursuing the same ultimate goal, tensions can arise from variations in culture, communication style, and institutional tradition. The achievement of Allied victory in Europe was therefore not simply a triumph of materiel and manpower, but also a success in negotiating human relationships at the highest levels of command.
As the war in Europe drew closer to its conclusion, the legacy of the January 1945 incident quietly persisted in the memories of those who had observed it firsthand. Some saw it as the moment when Eisenhower fully asserted the authority of his supreme command, leaving no doubt that coalition strategy would proceed according to principles he believed essential to final victory. Others interpreted it as a humbling experience for Montgomery, one that reminded him of the broader political context in which his battlefield responsibilities existed. Yet regardless of personal interpretation, the episode underscored the enduring truth that victory in World War II required unity not only in arms, but in attitude. In the years that followed, memoirs, biographies, and scholarly analyses revisited the crisis with increasing depth. Some authors emphasized the role of media framing and post-war narrative in amplifying the sense of confrontation, while others pointed to the structural challenges inherent in any multinational military effort. What remained consistent, however, was recognition of Eisenhower's restraint and professionalism, qualities that allowed the Allied coalition to withstand internal strains without fragmenting. His leadership during the crisis provided an instructive example of how moral authority can reinforce formal authority, particularly when the morale and dignity of millions of soldiers are at stake. In the years that followed, memoirs, biographies, and scholarly analyses revisited the crisis with increasing depth. Some authors emphasized the role of media framing and post-war narrative in amplifying the sense of confrontation, while others pointed to the structural challenges inherent in any multinational military effort. What remained consistent, however, was recognition of Eisenhower's restraint and professionalism, qualities that allowed the Allied coalition to withstand internal strains without fragmenting. His leadership during the crisis provided an instructive example of how moral authority can reinforce formal authority, particularly when the morale and dignity of millions of soldiers are at stake. And the command crisis inside Allied High Command during World War II, returning to the decisive atmosphere of the Western Front in early 1945. The tension between personalities, strategies, egos, and national expectations did not vanish after Eisenhower's blunt warning to Bernard Montgomery. Instead, it evolved into a careful, politically charged balancing act in which victory had to be achieved without shattering the fragile unity of the Allied coalition. On the morning of Saturday, February 24, 1945, during the final winter of World War II, the Allied armies were preparing for the massive Rhine River crossings that would open the gateway into the heart of Western Germany, and the conversations between commanders were no longer about personal prestige, but about how to end the war as efficiently, decisively, and cooperatively as possible. In this phase of the war, the historical context matters deeply because by early 1945, the Allied forces were not only winning, but also managing the political consequences of victory. Every decision made at headquarters carried diplomatic meaning, shaping future relations between the United States and Britain. The educational value of this moment lies in understanding that military leadership during World War II was never conducted in a vacuum. Decisions were shaped by logistics, national pride, battlefield realities, and the immense psychological strain of a war that had already lasted more than 5 years. When Eisenhower spoke sharply to Montgomery, it was not simply anger or frustration. It was a calculated assertion of authority designed to preserve unity and prevent internal conflict from undermining the Allied war effort at a decisive moment. As operations along the Rhine intensified, Allied planning became more complex and more collaborative. The armies of Omar Bradley, George Patton, and Courtney Hodges were pressing forward along the central and southern sectors, while Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared its own carefully organized assault in the north. The narrative of World War II at this point demonstrates how the military leaders had to balance speed against caution. Patton favored rapid, aggressive maneuver to collapse German resistance through momentum, while Montgomery emphasized deliberate preparation, massive firepower, and tight control of formations. Eisenhower's role was not to choose one philosophy over the other permanently, but to coordinate both approaches so that they complemented each other rather than collided. In educational and historical terms, this period reveals how coalition warfare requires more than battlefield skill. It requires emotional control, political awareness, and a willingness to compromise. After Eisenhower's warning, Montgomery adjusted his tone in communications, becoming more measured in how he presented criticism and more careful in acknowledging American contributions to the campaign. While this did not erase his self-confidence or his belief in his own strategic judgment, it did mark a turning point in his relationship with the Supreme Commander. From this point forward, Montgomery operated within clearer boundaries, aware that Eisenhower was fully prepared to defend the authority of the unified Allied command. Throughout March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine in multiple sectors, the internal tensions of previous months gradually gave way to a renewed sense of operational focus. The historical accuracy of this phase of World War II reminds us that disagreements among commanders did not prevent victory, but they did influence how operations unfolded. When Eisenhower insisted on cooperation and discipline from Montgomery, he was ensuring that the final advance into Germany would be conducted as a joint effort rather than a contest for post-war prestige. The Rhine crossings themselves symbolized that unity. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces took part in one of the most complex river assault operations in modern military history. At the same time, the German military situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Western Front faced collapsing defenses, dwindling manpower, and severe shortages of fuel and transport. Yet even in decline, German forces continued to resist fiercely in towns, forests, and fortified positions. This harsh reality reinforced the importance of Allied unity. Every mile of ground gained cost lives, and every delay extended the suffering of civilians across Europe. Eisenhower's insistence that his commanders put aside rivalry was not only a matter of organizational control, it was also a moral decision rooted in the desire to shorten the war. During the final weeks of the conflict in Europe, the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery settled into a tense but workable balance. Montgomery continued to command effectively in the northern sector, leading British and Canadian formations through the Netherlands and into northern Germany. Eisenhower, meanwhile, focused increasingly on the broader strategic picture, coordinating the drive toward the Elbe River and preparing for the political challenges that would emerge once Allied armies came into contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. In this broader educational perspective, the story shows how the Western Allies were already thinking beyond battlefield victory toward the shape of the post-war world. By April 1945, as World War II in Europe approached its final collapse, the lessons of the earlier confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery had become firmly embedded in Allied command culture. Eisenhower's authority remained unquestioned, and his firm handling of internal disputes set a tone that helped carry the coalition through the final operations of the campaign. Montgomery, while still proud and assertive, had adapted to the reality that strategic leadership in a multinational wartime alliance required restraint as well as confidence. The historical narrative of this period underscores that even great military coalitions are made up of human beings, flawed, ambitious, proud, and deeply affected by the pressures of war. The confrontation in which Eisenhower warned Montgomery so bluntly has become one of the most memorable command moments of World War II, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed the underlying challenge of maintaining unity among powerful personalities. It demonstrates how leadership is tested not only in battle, but also in conversation, negotiation, and crisis management. As the war drew to its final days in May 1945, the Allied leadership had achieved what earlier crises had threatened to undermine: a coordinated, disciplined, and unified command that brought the Western Front to victory. The internal disputes did not erase the contributions of any commander, nor did they diminish the sacrifices of the millions of soldiers who fought, suffered, and endured. Instead, they remind us that history is shaped by tension as well as cooperation, by personality as well as principle. In the educational spirit of examining this critical moment in World War II, the enduring lesson is that unity in warfare must be actively preserved. Eisenhower's decisive intervention during his dispute with Montgomery stands as a case study in coalition leadership, showing how authority, diplomacy, and firmness must coexist when the stakes are nothing less than the outcome of a global conflict.